on it. She's one of the first journalists to have ever covered the emerging tech industry in Silicon Valley when we were very rapidly growing as such. One of the best known technical writers, written numerous books about the industry. We have his latest book here, Big Score, the $1 billion story of Silicon Valley, on its re-release. And we have copies of it, and Mike will be able to sign it, and then you can just go down to the museum store and pay your way out for it. However, Mike's involvement in learning Sunnyvale history actually started way before that. When his father was president of the Historical Society, and he was a young Boy Scout. So a few years ago, the Malone family became strong supporters of saving our history over many decades. You'll recognize the family name as sponsors of the introduction room downstairs. One of our first substantial and passionate donors to this building. Mike's generously continued his support and was also involved in the design of the high-tech exhibit behind you. In fact, he wrote every word that you read on it. So Mike Malone, welcome.
It's a big crowd. I didn't expect this many people. I'll live up to your expectations. It's an honor to be here. Laura invited me. I was thrilled. You know, I've attended speeches here over the years. I've obviously spent a lot of time. In fact, I've been involved with this museum for just short of 60 years. As Laura said, I was a Boy Scout working on a merit badge, and I had checked books out from the Sunnyvale Library about the early history of Sunnyvale, because we had just moved there a couple of years before from Mountain View. And I read through the book slightly, just enough to get my merit badge out of the chair. But I left it lying around, and my father picked it up. He started reading it. And at 7 o'clock the next morning, a cold Saturday morning, he woke me up and said, "Get dressed, we're gonna go look at something." And we drove down to Murphy Park, and there we stood in a vacant lot on top of pieces of the Murphy house, which had been torn down just a few years before. And at that moment, my father said, "I'm gonna join the Historical Society, and we're going to rebuild the Murphy House." So 1965, that was. For many years, they operated, many of you saw it, basically a closet at the museum at Murphy Park. And then it kind of shifted to empty schoolroom at Rayner School to plan first the 100-year celebration of the Murphy 50th anniversary. The big barbecue in Washington Park. And then I was lucky to be invited to give testimony in front of the city council when they announced they were going to support this museum and give one. Showing a lot more wisdom than they did when they tore down the Murphy house. And I've watched this place grow. I was honored to be invited to build that timeline of history back there. And if you walk around this place, there's the Malone families all over the place, not only above the door at the entrance, the initial exhibit, but you'll find one of my old tables, Victorian table in a coffee shop. If you buy anything with the Murphy House logo on it, that was drawn by my wife, just back from art school in her early 20s, and on and on. It's always a pleasure to help this museum. In fact, that's what those books are. They're kind of a museum piece themselves. I originally wrote that book. It was my first book in 1984. Damn near killed myself in the process. It came out, and I would have made more money working at the window of McDonald's at the same period of time. And then about 10 years later, it started being called a classic. And then about a year and a half ago, Strike Press got a hold of me and said, "We want to come out. We want to put you in the Classics of Electronics Library." I thought, well, that's cool. My copies were literally, the pages were falling out because Doubleday was so broke when they printed my book. I think they printed it on wood pulp and glued it together. So it was nice to have, and they made a beautiful copy. When you pick it up, it's heavy, it's glossy, it's glorious. So 40 years after I wrote it, I finally feel a little vindicated. That was the first time I actually got royalties on that book, so that'll tell you what a writer's life is like. Now, I try to, when I talk, especially here, to find a different angle on the Sunnyvale story. I mean, to go in front of the Sunnyvale Historical Society and tell you some story about Sunnyvale history is kind of, Coles and Newcastle. You guys can correct almost everything I have to say. But I want to take a different tack. And I chose this because after all these years of reporting, I've been a newspaper reporter, a magazine editor. Currently, I have a podcast, and I'm a regular contributor to the BBC World Radio about Silicon Valley. And I've come to truly believe that Sunnyvale is a world historic location. Let me give you an example. I wrote in the preface to a book about Sunnyvale that if you look at the corner, the intersection of Bernardo and Fremont Avenue, pretty desolate intersection. I live about a block and a half in. I own the Wright House, the oldest surviving house, thank you, City Council, in Sunnyvale, probably in Silicon Valley, the oldest American house in Silicon Valley. Well, at that corner, Bernardo, Fremont, the on-ramp to 85, pretty empty place. But if you go back to the late 1960s, in the late afternoon, you would have seen Bob Noyce, the inventor of the integrated circuit, racing his Mercedes over the speed limit down Fremont to his house next to the Los Altos golf course. You would have seen Ted Hoff, who worked for Bob Noyce, the designer of the microprocessor, and you would have seen Steve Wozniak on his bicycle coming up from swim practice at Cherry Chase Swim Club to his house on Wright Avenue. In other words, you would have seen the inventor of the integrated circuit, the inventor of the microprocessor, and the inventor of the modern personal computer, all meeting at that intersection. To find an event like that, you probably have to go to Heraclean Greece, Athens, maybe Dublin in the 1890s, when you would have seen James Joyce and help me, who else was there? Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde. They all would have crossed paths, and maybe Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company bookshop in Paris. Okay. You don't find nexi of great figures like that very often in history. And it's here in Sunnyvale. And I want to take that and try to elaborate a different story, a different narrative about this city. When we think of it as one of the most important places on earth, when we realize that people are going to be talking about Sunnyvale 500 years from now for what happened here during our lifetimes, it behooves us to look at the whole story of this city and how it came to be and why it became essentially the heart of Silicon Valley and the mecca lures of the technology revolution. So what happened? Well, let's take a different slant. We typically tell the story of Sunnyvale in 2 chapters with a bridge in between. The first chapter is agriculture, farmland, canneries, all the way up until essentially the late 1920s. Then we have aerospace, which is Lockheed and all those black box projects out there, Lockheed Industrial Park. We still don't know what they were doing. And then we get the digital age, Silicon Valley, as we call it. Well, that's one way to look at the story, but it has, and this museum is set up that way, right? You go to the first floor and there's the the Murphy party journey across the Sierra and the Murphy parlor and dining room. And then you go and look at the agricultural stuff and the canneries, and you get a little glimpse of Lockheed. Then you come upstairs and it's tech. And that's how we like to tell that story, because it's easy. It seems to break into two parts. But I'm going to argue there's a single narrative of this town, and it's continuous, and it's still going. And that's the story of entrepreneurship. I think Sunnyvale is more emblematic of modern industrial revolution, post-industrial revolution, electronic revolution, entrepreneurship than any place on earth. And I'll tell you why. We're too busy to realize, I think, just how important this place is. We're working so hard. Even when we're retired, we're working hard. But if we're working for tech companies, we're really working hard. If we're in startups, we don't see daylight. We don't see our kids for several years. Well, if I can remind you, in the last 3 weeks, we have added another, well, let's put it this way. I climb on the roof of my 1860 house, which is about 4 stories tall when you include the point. And if the trees weren't there, I could see Google headquarters, Meta Facebook headquarters, Apple, the Death Star, Intel, and I could see the Microsoft division out by the theaters out there, and I can see the newest member, NVIDIA. If you count them all, there's currently 4 companies around and in Sunnyvale with a value each of $3 trillion. They are the most valuable companies in enterprises in human history. And they're right here. And we drive by them every day. And I want you to take a moment to think about that. That's just a stunning thing that I don't know any time in history there's been that much accumulation of wealth capital in one place. And it's called Sunnyvale. So, if I would, I'd like to tell you the story of Sunnyvale as a single story of entrepreneurship. Because I think what this city is about, and has always been about, is entrepreneurship. And I want to take you through the history you all know. In fact, you can walk through this museum after I get done with this talk, and you can see everything I'm just about to tell you about right here. That's one of the reasons why this museum is so important, because this is the archive. This is the repository of that history. That's the message we gave to the city council a few weeks ago when we asked for that annex back there. And ironically, we probably should have asked for 3 times as much, because every council member said, oh, this is the jewel of Sunnyvale. We've got to keep building it. Oh, great. We aim low, which is probably not a good idea with government. Anyway, let me tell you why there's 2 problems. I love the presentation here, and it's fitting, especially fitting for school kids. But let me tell you 2 problems that come with it. The first one is we tend to take the older story and write it off as prehistory, doesn't have much to say to us, interesting silverware and furniture in the Murphy parlor, but what does it say to us now? And it says a lot, but I think at first glance, it doesn't. And I think a lot of visitors walk right by that looking for the tech stuff. The second is, when you look at the tech stuff, you look at that timeline of history back there and look at all the companies mentioned on it, most of them are gone. And it's because the valley moves so quickly. So hundreds of companies in boom times like the dot-com era, like now, thousands of companies are being born every year, and hundreds are dying. So all the famous companies that we all knew in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they're either gone or they're shells of their former self. So what do we celebrate on the second floor of this museum? That raises a question, and I think I may have a way to answer it. So what I want to suggest is, let's go back to the very beginning and see why Sunnyvale is the way it is, why it's entrepreneurial. And to do that, we first have to start with, what's an entrepreneur? What are they like? Well, we think we know. It's guys who start, men and women who start companies. Okay, but psychologists have studied entrepreneurs. And what they aren't is CEOs. When you look at the people running these companies around here, they're not entrepreneurs. They're professional managers. They're business people. They're the guys who went to Harvard and Wharton to learn how to count beans and expand the company. Entrepreneurs are a very different breed. They don't live in Los Altos. They live in Sunnyvale, and they come from the ranks of middle managers, engineers, and scientists. And they are individuals. Who do you think they're most like? What are the studies found about entrepreneurs? What other job are they most like? Peace Corps volunteers. Now that may sound bizarre, but think about it. These are individuals who go out on their own with an idea, with a goal, not just to start a business, not to start a dry cleaners or something. They want to build something great, and they want to change the world. But most of all, they want to run their own lives. Entrepreneurs are usually not fun people. If you've ever known one, they're kind of monomaniacs, but they're free. They're alone. They are reconstructing the reality they want. And they have to have certain skills, imagination, or find people that have those skills. And they have to bring them all together, and they have to construct an enterprise, and then go out and find the capital. They have to sell that story, that vision, to the people that are going to write big checks. Then they have to build that company, and they have to scale it. If you've ever noticed, there's not a lot of founders who are still running big companies in Silicon Valley. That's because it's two different personality traits. In fact, I've actually had one of the biggest entrepreneurs in the Valley, most successful. I found him in his office once just staring at the wall, and I said, "What happened?" And he said, "It's all over." I said, "The company's in bankruptcy?" He said, "No. The good times are over. We just hired the first person who in his job interview said, 'Well, I want a corner office.'" He said, "Startup teams, you design the product, you solder it together, you help write the marketing plan, you clean the toilets, and you go out to the store to get, coffee." That's what an entrepreneur is, and the teams that start entrepreneurial enterprises. So these are unique individuals. So let's look back through the filter of that and see what we find in Sunnyvale's history. Okay, let's start with, well, first of all, we have to go a little bit down the road because there was nobody here in the 1750s, except for a few tule elk and bears. For the most part, though, it was Ohlone Indians, which you can see downstairs. You can actually see their faces thanks to Santa Clara University shutting their anthropology department. We're very lucky to be the recipients of things from other places that have shut down. Santa Clara had a wonderful anthropology department, and they had done facial reconstructions of the faces of the Ohlone Indians. You can go down and look at them. And they were remarkable people. They built those gigantic burial mounds that we only just learned about again after 100 years. In fact, we have a new park named after it. These things were the size of football fields and 100 feet tall. And they were just bones and garbage and dirt. And when you crossed the bay in 1870, you could have seen them on the edge of Sunnyvale, these giant mounds. Well, that's an interesting endeavor. It's not quite entrepreneurial. We have to wait for the Franciscans to show up and then turn it over to the Jesuits. The Franciscans, now think about Father Serra. He's a man with a vision. He's willing to lose everything. He gets funded by a king, and he sets off into Who knows? The edge of the world, heading up to California, starting missions. Why? To change the world, to build an institution. In this case, the missions, especially Mission Santa Clara, that will accomplish something greater than himself. And he pulls it off. In many ways, he's the very first entrepreneur. He also, interestingly enough, Mission Santa Clara put the valley on a clock. You always wonder, what's making you get up at 7 o'clock in the morning to go to work? Well, the mission bells rang, I think, 5 or 6 times a day, from matin to vespers, like that. Well, that bell set the pattern for the activities of the Franciscans, then the Jesuits at the mission, and at the children's school and all that. Well, those bells got assimilated into the Ohlone, because they basically had a great life. They just sat around, procreated, ate acorns, and occasionally raided their neighbors to steal the daughters back and forth. But once that bell started, it was time to head on down to the mission. So Mission Santa Clara really begins the story of the valley, but it also begins the story of Sunnyvale, because you could have heard those bells all the way up here. All right, now we get Martin Murphy. We got a whole room downstairs for him. Martin Murphy is interesting because what does he do? He's living back east. He decides that he's going to pack up and risk everything, take a wagon train out to California and see what he can make of it. And they went through some extraordinary experiences. You can watch the movie made, I think, in Nebraska, all about that trip. How does he end up? He ends up the first tycoon in Silicon Valley. And, well, you've seen his house. The thing that blew my mind away is when you look at the old photos of the Murphy house, that, the one in the new logo, is square. It's as deep as it is wide. That's a big place, especially when you consider it was brought around the horn. This is an Elon Musk type of move. But on top of that, for his 50th wedding anniversary, he invited the entire state of California to come to his farm, his ranch, and celebrate. And it was 1881. By that point, Martin Murphy, it is believed, was the largest landowner in the Western Hemisphere, because he bought land in South America. He bought land all over here. He bought everything down to Mount Hamilton, quite a ways beyond. This was a guy who came with a wagon, and he ends up owning a measurable portion of earth. An entrepreneur. And I'll throw another one, the guy who built my house, William Wright. He starts out as a clerk in a department store in Baltimore. Reads some penny dreadfuls about California, the golden land, the land of gold. And he sets off with some of his fellow workers. They get on a boat, they get to Rio, and the captain leaves, dumps them there. So they have to catch another boat. Then they come all the way around South America. They're off the Isthmus of Panama, and they're becalmed for about 2 weeks. And they start to starve. They finally get to San Francisco. All but 2 of them are done. They've been through too much. They go home, back east. Martin and his friend stick around. They know about the gold fields. They decide to go up. He's not an entrepreneur. He's a risk taker at this point. They get to the gold fields. The other partner leaves. It's just Martin, and he's panning for gold. He has a really good year. He finds a lot of gold. He's getting ready for another good year, and then they have a winter just like the one we just had. And the rivers swell, and it wipes out his claim. So he thinks, well, what am I going to do now? He takes his money, his gold earnings, heads down to Sacramento, buys a bunch of supplies and a wagon, going through mud and everything else after the rains, brings it back up to the gold field. You've heard stories about these guys. They came back and sold supplies. They're the only guys that actually got rich in the California gold rush. was selling supplies. Now he's an entrepreneur. He comes back down, he meets Martin Murphy, and Martin had convinced the guy who ran Mountain View, the Spanish landlord, to give him Rancho Pastorias de las Barrigas, right here. And so he's got Sunnyvale. And William Wright goes up to him and says, I'm an American. You want to sell me some land? And he said, oh yeah, we need Americans here. We're going to be a state one of these days. So he gives William Wright 160 acres, half a section. And Wright grows it to about 320 acres, a full section. And he has, like everybody else, because this is all ranch land, it's just ranch land, dotted by a bunch of huge oak trees. The oak tree at the end of Ticonderoga was a brick stone house it is now. There's a picture of it. It had a branch diameter of 150 feet. That's a big tree. Of course, we all moved in here and put in sprinkler systems, which immediately killed all the old oak trees. But William Wright hears about an old technology, but new technique called artesian wells. Everyone assumed it was too dry to do anything here. He starts drilling, and he finds water. And next thing you know, Silicon Valley Santa Clara Valley has 1 billion trees, fruit trees. It's providing most of the fruit being shipped back east. By the way, that shipping was creating a supply chain that was the beginning of that, too. Another piece of entrepreneurship. William Wright irrigated, and when you drive down Wright Avenue, that's the driveway to the house. My house doesn't line up with it because the headlights from all the trucks going back and forth with all the fruit and threw up so much dust, they moved the house over. That's where the drying shed is. So if you go by Stratford School, those are the drying sheds for the original orchard in Sunnyvale. Okay, let's go forward a little bit. Let's go to 1903. Now we have a different kind of entrepreneur, a guy named Walter Crossman. I think people in this room may have actually heard that name, but I'm not sure anybody else did. He was the kind of guy, he's kind of like today's John Sobrato, a real estate tycoon, hustler, con man, salesman. And he bought up a lot of what's now downtown Sunnyvale. And he originally called it Murphy. Okay, well, there's a lot of Murphys in California, if you've been in the gold country. So he put it up to the people that had bought some of his early lots. He was taking out ads in the old Mercury, the old News, business papers, trying to sell lots, just like we saw right after World War II around here. And he marked them out on the ground, and he wasn't going to build them until he got purchases. And the very first people that bought lots, he crowdsourced them for a name. And, well, happily but sadly, they came up with Sunnyvale. And it stuck. Now I have to tell you, I don't know about you guys, but when I have to give my address on the telephone, and I have to say, I live at 1234 Cranberry Avenue, Sunnyvale. I literally have people snicker on the ground. It's like, okay, yeah, what's your real address? And then you'll say, how do you get 1234? I said, well, I think we were 1. And then we got more houses, so they put a 2 on the end. And they just kept going until they got to 4 and stopped. But Sunnyvale it is, and this is the name that, how many of you used to say, when the people out there on the East Coast, let's say, or Europe, and I say, where do you live? What'd you say? San Francisco, or California.
Yeah, San Francisco, always.
And then San Francisco, like, oh, in the city? Well, not exactly.
Yeah.
And then it was the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Then it was Silicon Valley, San Jose, Silicon Valley. And now you can just say Sunnyvale almost anywhere in the world. And people go, oh yeah, Silicon Valley. Yeah, I know where it is. Where the hangar used to be.
Yeah.
What are they doing? You all know that they're tearing down hangar 1. 3. But what-
One is being released finally.
Wait a minute. No, I'm seeing pictures.
Was in the paper yesterday.
They're tearing down. They're tearing down the Macon. Well, that's the Macon hangar, right?
No.
What's it? The 2 of them are out by the golf course.
Those are the wooden ones.
Yeah,
The
they're
wooden
master-
ones are being torn down, or one of them.
Hangar 3 is the wooden one that we're tearing down.
Oh,
Hangar 1 will be resurfaced.
okay. Well, that's what I always heard.
By the beginning of next year.
But you saw the photograph. doesn't it look like they were tearing the big one down?
No.
Yeah. Have you been out to hangar 2 or 3? Inside, they are architectural masterpieces. All that wood, they're amazing. Yeah, I invite you all to go see it before Google decides that they need to talk to people to tear that down too. Okay, so Walter Crossman was a true entrepreneur. He came out here with a vision. He worked his butt off. He was a salesman. He was an engineer, but he engineered how to build a suburban community from scratch. And we're the recipients of that. Next, Hendy Ironworks. Okay, Hendy Ironworks was, you all know this, I'm sure you're in the Historical Society, you've been to the Hendy Museum. Hendy Ironworks started in San Francisco. I think it might have been closer to South San Francisco, but it was in San Francisco. Second earthquake hits. Hendy decided, maybe we want to move to suburbia. Let's go down the peninsula, and they moved down here. Okay, Hendy isn't an entrepreneurial venture, but it provides a living, a technical living, to start drawing engineers to Silicon Valley. And as Hendy went along and got to World War I and World War II, it became a very inventive outfit and provided a lot of stuff for both munitions for both wars. So in a sense, it was a company that, I don't know, like IBM, like HP, it changed its business to adapt to the time. Adaptability is one of the other attributes of an entrepreneur. There's not a single big company in this town that started out being what it is now. Just look at their history. I mean, Netscape was going to be a game company. HP, Bill and Dave started out making audio oscillators for Disney, but they also tried to invent an automatic bowling pin resetter and a few other items. They only settled on being an instrument company. And then they became a computer company. Then they became a personal computer company. Then they became a printer company. That's adaptability. You've got to have that in this town because you never know how you're going to end up. No matter where you start, you're going to change. So Hendy manifests that. The canneries, they pioneered new agricultural technologies, packaging technologies, and they're the ones that really perfected the supply chain of products coming out of this valley. When I talk about things being lost, think about Del Monte Cannery. When I was in high school, I interned at NASA, and we take a bus right by the Del Monte Canneries. And I remember half the year I was in heaven smelling those fruit cocktails and the cherries, and the other half of the year I was gagging because it was tomato season. It's all gone. It's just a water tower, and that's what we lose unless we have some maverick types that fight to save stuff. This is one of those places. We couldn't save the Murphy House, but we could save what was in it, and we could save the rest of the history of Old Valley and tell the story anew. Let me tell you a story about another maverick. Her name was Fern Ort. She was an 80-year-old lady, and she would go to the Sunnyvale City Council meeting and try to get up and speak, and they never called on her. I think she was there for a year, month after month, trying to be heard. As it happens, I found out about her and wrote a story about her for the Mercury News, and then the Palo Alto Times picked it up, and the city council finally gave her a hearing. And what she had to say was that there was a stand of, I think it was 6 trees, redwood trees, and they had been planted over the course of the first 50 years of the 20th century as memorials to tragic events in this town. Not just, men who died in World War I and II, but a car crash at graduation from Fremont High School and other things. The city of Sunnyvale realized that they'd almost lost under the Murphy House. And so when you guys went to the town center years ago, do you remember that little rainforest in there with those trees, the redwood trees? Those were Fern's trees. Okay, when they tore down the town center, if you had driven down there, you would have seen 5, because one of them had already died, emaciated redwood trees out in the middle of a vacant lot. And there they stood for 20 years until the Merc went out and did a story on them again. And now the city of Sunnyvale is preserving those trees, building a little park around them. And they're going to bring those trees back. Fern's trees are going to survive us if we're lucky. That's what we risk at all times if we only tell the new story and not the old anymore. Okay, now we get to a very interesting father and son you know about. I'm not sure how many of the rest of you do. Albert Bessie Sr. and Jr. Okay, they're interesting because they straddle the two worlds. The father invented the incubator, the egg incubators you see downstairs. The son created the Valley's first startup, the first true startup. So you have an entrepreneur father in agriculture and an entrepreneur son in electronics.
So we have the echo.
Yes, that's what we're talking about. He created the radio shop. In that, he built the Echo phone, which is a very, very early radio. Now, he'd be lost to history, except his little Echo phone lasted about 20 years, and they got taken over by another company, Hallicrafters. Hallicrafters became the great radio of people listening to shortband radio in the 50s and 60s. We have one here. They created a military version called the EC-1. And that's the radio you see the soldiers in the field in World War II using. So the Albert Bessie Jr. gave us communications in World War II. Okay, now we get to HP. Now we all think of HP, yeah, the Packard Garage on Addison Way in Palo Alto, and HP on the hill on Pageville Road. But HP hired an awful lot of citizens of Sunnyvale over those 50 years. And when it came time, where to go? It set up its calculator division and its MIDI computer division. MIDI computer division was in Sunnyvale. The calculator division was across the street where Steve Wozniak worked in Cupertino. But when HP built its personal computers, they were just over here on the Central Expressway. So the golden company of Valley history, arguably the greatest company of all time, had its foot in Sunnyvale. And it would play an important role in its existence. Okay, now we get to the place we're going to build the annex for. Lockheed. Lockheed is actually a Sunnyvale company, the original Lockheed in its roots. The Lockheed brothers grew up in Los Gatos. They were actually, I think they actually knew Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine. They were about contemporaries, who also, it was an artist colony. It was a bunch of bohemians. Well, the two brothers wanted to fly. They wanted to build airplanes. And they also didn't want to die. So they went out on the bay, right out here with seaplanes, and tested their early planes. Well, by the end of the 30s, they had moved down to Burbank because there were a lot more available airfields down there. But after World War II, and there was a huge company at that point, They wanted to build rockets. They saw that as the next big thing, especially military rockets. And they thought, let's go home. And that's why they ended up in Sunnyvale. And anybody here under 40 years old probably doesn't realize that up until about 1980, the largest employer in Silicon Valley was still Lockheed. More than HP, more than Intel, more than National Semiconductor, more than Tandem, Lockheed. Now, Lockheed was an entrepreneurial activity of the 20s. By the time I moved here, it really wasn't, though it was an enormous innovator. But what it was a magnet for technologists to come out here. Not just rocket motors and telemetry and that sort of thing, but communications, radar, all the support stuff that goes with making ICBMs and Minutemen and all of that. And it filled Sunnyvale with technology people. It filled Mountain View too. And that's why Steve Jobs, I was a neighbor of Steve Jobs in Mountain View when I was real little. Everybody on our block was a technologist. They worked for Lockheed, they worked for HP, or they worked for NASA Ames. In 1970, Lockheed, Vietnam War ended, Apollo was winding down, and so Lockheed had the worst layoff in the history of the valley. I grew up on Ticonderoga in an Eigler. Every other house on my block, basically, the dad lost his job. And a lot of them went into real estate, a lot of them went into banking, some moved away, but an awful lot of them went sideways into tech. They had the empirical skills, but they didn't have the electronic skills. They had to learn that. But they peopled most of the startups of the 70s and 80s in this valley. Let's get to an unexpected one. Another real estate guy, another hustler with a vision, Joseph Eichler. Joseph Eichler starts in Sunnyvale. He starts down there on Fair Oaks. He bought a real estate developer had failed, and there was a whole bunch of unfinished houses, and he bought them and finished them and added a few Eichler-esque touches. And if you drive down Fair Oaks down towards Old San Francisco Road, you can see him on the left down those streets. Those are proto-Eichlers. And he was a man with a vision too, which was, we're going to build basically modernist houses, the Barcelona Pavilion houses for the masses. We're going to build houses that are glass, and they have atriums, and they have cool lines, and nothing's square, everything's rectangular. And he perfected it in Sunnyvale. And then he expanded it to Palo Alto. I remember when Los Arboles I remember when Fairbury got built and Los Arboles in Palo Alto. And then he started spreading out. He went to Southern California. And he created basically what's called California Modern Design. There are actually magazines about atomic era homes, and people collect them. I mean, I grew up in one. My wife grew up in one around the corner on Shenandoah. And when we went looking for a house, we ended up with a 140-year-old house. But we started out looking for an Eichler because all my life I'd spent my life on the floor with the radiant heating. I got to my ancient house, historic house. I was cold all the time because I was always on the floor. Well, his vision created a brand new architecture. He hired the best California architects, and these guys were doing really expensive custom homes in Berkeley and Palo Alto, and the peninsula, in Mill Valley. And he sent them to creating affordable homes that looked California, looked modern. And they still look modern. I mean, I'd buy an Eichler in a heartbeat if I, had the chance. And I'd fix it up and I'd put a Studebaker Golden Hawk in the carport, and unfortunately, they also had beautiful mahogany paneling inside. And that's why the house next door to mine doesn't look like, the house next door to the one I grew up in, doesn't look like mine because Eichler insulated and fire protected the garage, thinking that's where fire started. But he didn't count on the shallow stoves, which when the insulation burned off, started all the fires. So the house next door to mine, I was in junior high school with my next door neighbor on the playground. We looked out and started singing "Someone's House is Burning Down" because of the pillar of smoke. And it turned out to be his house. And the fire station at Ticonderoga and Mary is 4 blocks away. They didn't get there in time. Well, they saved the garage. It was still standing, but they put water on my house. So they're fragile, but damn, they are beautiful. They are works of art. And you see them being copied all over the place even now. They're so retro, they're in. So that's Joe Eichler. And he built quite an empire. And then he got ambitious and tried to build 20-story condominiums in San Francisco and went bust. Okay, next company. There was a guy, he was in grad school at BYU, and on the weekends he made his money being a barker and a carny in a sideshow. And he took those two, and one of the things he liked to do was play the games on the big mainframe computer in the computer department at BYU. He decided, I'm going to put them together. And he looked around, he couldn't figure out how to do it affordably. And then the chip companies around here, the semiconductor companies, announced memory chips for under $10. And he said, that's it. I'm going to take these giant computer games, and I'm going to use my carny skills, and I'm going to put them into bars. And he took over one of his two daughters' bedrooms and started building it. And he worked with a guy named Alcorn, and they had it done, and they said, well, let's try it out. So they took this, basically a prototype, and put it in Andy Capp's pub, right over there, right where Highway 9, we all call it Highway 9, meets El Camino. And it's now Rooster Teeth Feathers Comedy Club. But they set this prototype up next to the pinball machines. And a few hours later, Al gets a call from the owner of the place and says, get over here, your damn game is busted. So he rushed over there and he looked at it and he looked in the back, and they just put a little cardboard box in the back with tape to collect the quarters. It was so full of quarters that it jammed the machine. And that's when they said, I think we're on to something. And they started Atari. Okay? That was the wildest company, except for another one that we'll talk about in a second called Fairchild. But Atari was insane. It was a hot tub company. And they named all their new products the code names after the hottest secretaries in the office. So, and it was very, very 70s. And eventually it sold to Warner Communications. But before it did, it created the video game industry, the computer game industry, which is now, well, my kids are playing it. I got a 33-year-old and 27-year-old playing video games right now while I'm here talking. It's a $1 trillion industry all over the world, and it just keeps growing, generation after generation. And the software companies that started creating the games, one of the big ones was Electronic Arts here in Sunnyvale. Now, let's get back to another company. Right, well, it started at San Antonio Road Central in Allen, moved down to Ellis Street, and it was always there right on the edge of Sunnyvale, full of Sunnyvale engineers. But it was called Fairchild. It started out as Fairchild Camera, an instrument, but an entrepreneurial guy. Got sick of listening to his bosses in New Jersey. He even went back in a snowstorm and got there and discovered they had locked the door and hadn't told him. And he said, that's it. I'm going to take Fairchild. I'm going to spin it off. And he created Fairchild Semiconductor. And in the process, he took his invention, the integrated circuit, made it the product. He put together his old team that they had walked out of Shockley Semiconductor, the traitorous eight, and they went out and found money and created the venture capital industry, which is now also a $1 trillion industry, which is the key to entrepreneurship, at least in the United States. And they began building chips. Well, there was so much talent inside Fairchild, they really only lasted about 8 years, and they blew up. They just disintegrated. There was so much talent, and everybody realized they could go do what Bob Noyce just did and start their own company. And they all left, and they peppered the valley. The two most interesting are Intel, which also has offices here, but it's down on Bowers. Intel became the most important company on the planet, especially with the invention of the microprocessor, Sunnyvale and Ted Hoff. Intel basically created the modern world because Bob Noyce's partner was a guy named Gordon Moore, and you probably heard of Moore's Law. It's the metronome of the modern world. It's the rate that technology innovation occurs. It was every 2 years, now it's about every 2.5, 3, 4. But it means things are always changing around here and continuously changing. That's why we have chips like the new NVIDIA one that has 2 trillion transistors on it, and it's the size of my thumbnail, or a little bit bigger. That's Moore's Law. That's why the world seems a little crazy sometimes, and you have to throw away perfectly good stuff because it's 4 generations obsolete, and your toaster talks to you, and your car's about to drive you, all because of the pace of Moore's Law. Well, out of Moore's Law spun another company. Even Moore's Law was pretty sedate, but the company spun out of it had a rather wacky salesman, CEO, entrepreneur. His name was Charlie Spork, and he built AMD in Sunnyvale. And AMD is one of the, 6 companies now that are leading the AI revolution. It's still here, it's bigger than ever, and it's racing towards $1 trillion too. So that's AMD. Now, I should mention that the guy who started Atari was Nolan Bushnell. Well, after Nolan Bushnell left Atari with his Warner money in his pocket, he set up in Lockheed Industrial Park in Sunnyvale. And I was a young reporter then, and I went to see him in his office. And he said, he was telling me what he was doing, but he said, let me show you something. And he took me over to a warehouse right next to 237, right next to the frontage road. Took me in, it was a big empty room, dark. And he flicked on the lights, and I jumped about 3 feet in the air because there were giant puppets looking at me, including a giant rat, which I really didn't understand. And I said, what is this? And he said, I'm going to make pizza. He says, you can make the worst pizza in the world, but if you have good entertainment and you have games for kids, you're going to get rich. Chuck E. Cheese. Now Pizza Times Theater. As of last week, they turned off all the puppets but 2. There's 90 restaurants left, and there's only 2 now that will have that ghastly show that terrified your children. And it was the kind of place, as an adult, having birthday parties, you didn't want to touch the tables. And you didn't want anything to fall on the floor. Because that was just kid chaos. Anyway, Nolan got rich again. Now we get to another company, another Sunnyvale company, which we tend to think of as Cupertino. But in fact, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, you probably drive by Wozniak's old house all the time. It's that one house on Wright Avenue that looks like, it's surrounded by Eichlers, but it doesn't look like an Eichler. Because the people who bought it from the Wozniaks changed it so badly that the neighbors complained and actually took it to the city. So it's pretty recognizable. But in there, and in the Jobs garage, up by Pete's on Homestead, they built the Apple I. Now, Wozniak was a fixture around here long before that because he had won the science fair building a four-function calculator. He and Steve built they were criminals basically. They built illegal telephone blue boxes. That's where they could hack telephones. That's how they made their name. And Wozniak got into computers in a big way, mainly because he got to play on the terminals out at Ames Research Center because his dad worked at Lockheed. They built the Apple I at both garages. And it's interesting because I saw them when they were in 1976. I saw them when they were building the Apple I. They would walk down Wright Avenue to Westmore Shopping Center, and they would go into what's now the Hallmark shop. It was Owen Wetzel's hobby shop to buy parts. And I remember seeing them, these three scruffy guys. It was Woz, Jobs, and Fernandez, the son of Sunnyvale's mayor, and my Sunday school teacher. See these three guys, scruffy, shoulder-length hair, military fatigue jackets, and they were heading down to Owen's hobby shop, and I thought, they're buying alligator clips. They're buying marijuana roach chips, the clips. That's what they're doing. They're just a bunch of stoners. It's the 70s, And they were actually buying the parts that they could buy for the Apple I. And so the personal computer revolution, which is now, I think, a 10 trillion industry, was really started in Sunnyvale as well. So, we could go on. You think of the companies that are around here. Trimble Navigation. They're going to be leading the way when it comes to autonomous driving. I mentioned NVIDIA, the hottest company in the world and today and yesterday and for the last 3 weeks. Nothing seems to be able to stop NVIDIA. It's right on the border of Sunnyvale, but its autonomous driving division and a couple other of its divisions are in Sunnyvale. They're just across the road. Fry's, you have a bunch of kids, the sons of grocers, who say, let's get into technology retail. And they build this incredible empire until Jeff Bezos comes along. But before that, they were a massive entrepreneurial success story. Google's in Mountain View, but boy, it's across the street. You can spit across the street. You can see the backside of the wind tunnel at Moffett and across the way to Lockheed from the Google tent. LinkedIn, you can't get more Sunnyvale than LinkedIn. It's in the middle of LinkedIn. They took a part of downtown and put LinkedIn there. So now you have two of the most important companies of the social networking revolution, the most important technology revolution of the last 20 years are here. And out there by the theaters, out there not too far from Moffett, Microsoft has its Silicon Valley facility. That's where they're doing their AI development. And Microsoft is now the wealthiest company in the world as of a couple weeks ago. Why? Because of the AI they're doing out there. Sunnyvale is not only important, Sunnyvale is unbelievably important. It may be the most important community on the planet, looked from the proper perspective. And why is that? It's because of entrepreneurship. Sunnyvale is entrepreneurship. We're defined by it. We have the culture of it. Go to any theater around here, look at the ads, and try that in I don't know, Albuquerque. Try that in some other technology community. Look at the ads between the movies at Century 21. It's all technology ads. And if you don't know the proper verbiage, it sounds like it's Hittite. You have no idea what they're talking about, C++. We're looking for AI systems developers and on and on and on. We live and breathe technology here, whether we know it or not. You can go into any coffee place around. You're going to Starbucks at Westmore. On the other end of the shop is the strip mall from Owen Wetzel's old hobby shop. Go in there and look at all the people, adults. You're used to seeing guys sitting there writing poetry, you know. But you go around here and you see groups, little clumps of middle-aged professional people sitting around those little tables, and they've got a couple laptops open. And if you kind of peek over their shoulders, you see business plans. That's because that's what we do here. We build companies. We invent the future. It's in our blood. And people who leave here often come back. That's why people come from all over the world. I can guarantee you that we're going to see another $1 trillion company, or 10 or 20 in a few years, and a lot of them are going to be run by immigrants and women, because entrepreneurship is now being understood around the world and the value of this place, but it's also becoming more inclusive. If Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, look at the way they did, can build a $3 trillion company, anybody can. So we're all out to change the world. I think that's what sets apart entrepreneurs and what sets apart Sunnyvale. You know, everything I just told you, that trajectory that goes back all the way to Mission Santa Clara, 250 years. And what we see now tells me that there's a lot more to come. That maybe we're just at the beginning of the story of Sunnyvale. It seems like it's been around for a long time, but I think it's going to be around for a lot longer. But entrepreneurship is fragile. It doesn't have a constituency, and it doesn't have a voice in halls of power. We have to protect it. As long as the entrepreneurial spirit survives here and defines us, and as long as we nurture entrepreneurship here, this city that has one of the greatest stories of any city ever, that story is still waiting to be written. We're nowhere near the climax of this book. And it'll be here, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will study this place in our lives, in their textbooks. So thank you all, and thank you, Sunnyvale.